All right. Hey, thanks again, everyone out there in ID24 land. This is Mike Paciello with Paciello Group and my colleague John Metz. John, say hi.
Hi, how's everybody doing?
I should say the well-trained John Metz. Hey, we have a very special friend, good friend of mine and good colleague of many of the folks at TPG, about ready to launch into his next session, Cal Smith. For those of you that weren't on the last session, the title of Cal's presentation this afternoon is, or this morning, is Pixels, Plows, and Prescriptions, the Future of Wellness. So Cal, we're going to turn the show over to you. Go ahead, and I'm going to give you presentation rights now, and you can go off and do your thing, buddy.
Wonderful, thank you. I am going to share my screen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Let me do a screen share here, make sure that we are copacetic, and I will ask my friends if everything looks okay. Do you see a slide up on the screen, please?
We see, yeah, we do. We see your screen, and it looks like we see a screen full of slides.
Oh,
we see a whole montage.
Yeah.
Whole montage. Hang on a second here. Let me. This is odd. Anything yet? No.
Not yet.
Oh, okay. Uh-oh. All right. That's strange. It's not letting me do presentation mode, evidently. Okay. Okay. Do you see me actually moving the screen around? Let me try something else here. Hang on a second, please. All right. What if I do this? And how about this?
Yay!
There it is. There it is.
Apologies for that. Okay.
Awesome.
No worries. I would like to. My name is Cal Smith. Thank you to my friends and colleagues who've let me talk to all of you today on this very eventful ID24. I want to start with a story about water. It is actually, in a way, it's not about water. It is about the inherent optimism of design thinking. And I'll explain this. In certain developing areas of the world, for example, the Gambela region of Ethiopia and parts of the Indian subcontinent near the suburbs of Hyderabad, people fetch their water every day from a river or an urban borehole that's populated by that river. It can be a problem because sometimes the river gets polluted and children get sick, but they don't have any other choice. And so what sometimes private organizations or governments will try to do is they will install water treatment facilities so that people can get fresh, clean water when they need to. And what they have discovered in some of these territories is that nobody's using the facility. Now, why would somebody consciously choose to collect water from a polluted source rather than a free, clean source? Well, one of the reasons is because in order to use a facility, the people must use the government-issued 5-gallon container, which by itself may not be a problem when you consider that in many developing nations, think about this a little bit, people tend to carry heavy objects on their head. I don't know about many of you out there. I, for one, am not strong enough to lift 5 gallons of liquid and bounce it on my head. But that's one of those sort of behavioral design things that maybe they didn't quite think about. But there's another more important, more subtle reason, perhaps. And when they removed the river from the equation, when they no longer had a reason to go to the river, they removed an essential component of what makes these people who and what they are. See, everything happens at the river. It's where they congregate. It's where they educate their children. It's where they settle disputes. It's where they worship. It is really the center of their community. And by removing the river, they destroyed the very fabric of their society. And sometimes these well-meaning initiatives don't consider the culture and needs of the people who have to live within them. I got this example from a really interesting paper, which is written by these two folks, Tim Brown and Jocelyn Wyatt of IDEO. It's in the Stanford Innovation Review. I highly recommend it. And they said that time and again, these well-meaning initiatives falter because they are not based on the needs of people who actually have to use them. Now, what does this have to do with accessibility? Well, not really sure. So I'll give you another example. Maybe this is a little closer to home. I am showing a photo of something called the Higgy, H-I-G-I. I saw a prototype of it in South by Southwest, I think 3 years ago. It's a kiosk. There's a seat in the front. On the left is a blood pressure cuff. You can stick your arm in, it takes your blood pressure. On the panel in front of you are two sort of bars that you grab, and it captures your heart rate. There are ports for your glucometer if you have diabetes. There's a screen there, and all kinds of little devices and gadgets in this little sort of kiosk booth. And the idea being that this machine takes all of your inputs, rolls it up into a score which measures your health at that time, and then puts it into a social network where you can compare your score with those of your friends. And I was kind of intrigued when I saw this, because when the device was actually commercialized in retail pharmacies around the United States a year or two later, they mentioned that it was accessible to those with disabilities. And the idea being that if you were in a wheelchair, there's a green button on the side, and all you have to do is push the button and roll it back, and the wheelchair fits right in. You just kind of roll in. It's very easy. So I don't have many hobbies, so I'm always interested in things like this. And when it was announced and rolled out near where I live, which is between Philadelphia and New York City, I went on a little road trip, and I wanted to see how well it was implemented in these stores. And some places, it did a very good job. They put the device or the booth in a kind of its own room. It was maybe a little tight, but not awful. I mean, it was certainly workable. They had potpourri. It was okay. And then there were other stores where they had it in a high traffic area, surrounded by boxes, shopping carts, really kind of hazardous, just one of those afterthought things. And it was kind of intriguing to see this, because it struck me like how, in some ways, we had this very imperfect idea of what maybe makes consumer healthcare technology accessible to those who have to use them. And I think this is why inherent optimism sometimes fails. We start, and I do this too. I'm not trying to be like I'm above all this, because I'm really not. Because I love gadgets and I love the toys and I love the technology, and I think we all do. We are all part of this, and we understand that technology is there to really expand the horizons for those who need to rely on it. At the same time, we also recognize that sometimes technology by itself doesn't solve the problem. It has to do with understanding of the behavior. And sometimes it has to do with ensuring that the appropriate target is taken into account. Many healthcare technologies, on a consumer level, don't necessarily consider accessibility as part of its needs. It's the unmet need it's trying to solve. It's a little out of sync sometimes. And in fact, Wired magazine, about a year and a half ago, wrote an article about this called "Wearables Are Totally Failing the People Who Need Them the Most." And they talked about how things like wearables and the Internet of Things are becoming much more prevalent, but they're discounting those who really could use them. I'm going to read a quote from that article by J.C. Hertz. It starts off like this: "Developers continue flocking to a saturated market filled with hipster pet rocks, devices that gather reams of largely superficial information for young people whose health is not in question or at risk. It's a shame, because the people who could most benefit from this technology, the old, the chronically ill, the poor, the disabled, are being ignored." And I think they're right. I do. I think they're right. In that same article, the Journal of American Medicine was quoted as saying that the frailest and most vulnerable may be at risk as more aspects of healthcare move online. We may potentially be leaving behind the people who could most benefit from these devices and these services and these platforms, but we're not thinking about them, or at least we're not thinking about them early enough. A couple years ago, I was doing some research for a book I was writing, and I happened to talk to Dana Florence, who's the executive director of an organization called 3 Ms. Florence herself is the mother of 3 kids with cerebral palsy, and I remember watching her speak, and she said, you know, the most frustrating thing for me as a mother is waiting for something that we know we will not ever get to use. And I hear this all the time from parents of kids with disabilities. I know that there's something out there in a university laboratory that would really help my child, but I can't get access to it. I can't use it. I can't get on a clinical trial. Even if I could get it, I don't know if my insurance will cover it. I don't know if I can afford it. I'm a working mother. And these are some of the things that start to layer up. And no matter how good the technology solution might be, there's always these logistical barriers that sometimes that, I don't want to say that people haven't thought about it, but maybe they haven't thought about it enough. I did a study about 2 years ago with a number of folks with multiple sclerosis, and I had one person, and I've been asked to keep this person anonymous, but they said someone, and I remember they kind of pointed at me thinking, I think they meant me, like someone needs to go to these startups, these tech startups, and make sure that they understand the perspective of what it's really like to live with a disability, because they don't get it. And I think part of it is that healthcare is a very complex ecosystem, and it's easy to think it's just a relationship between patients and physicians. But it's much more than that, and I could do a whole presentation just on this, and I'll spare you that. But healthcare technology and the players who operate within a space, it covers as many as 300 security classes that will define every user role and every resource, every nurse or physician or therapist, every technician or billing clerk, every lab, every machine, every device, every examination room, patient record, every piece of operating equipment, or every medical chart. There are many, many interconnected dependencies within the space, and accessibility can really break down anywhere. So by the time you add the technology component, which involves admissions and logistics and transport and discharge and all the things that have to do with what happens to you when you are a consumer of your healthcare system, accessibility could fall apart anywhere in here. And it's not just a matter of the technology itself. Sometimes it's something else. I'm showing a photo of Natacha Jacobsen. I think today she is 65 or 66 years old. She lives in Oakland, California. She's brilliant. She's a writer by trade. She has 2 PhDs. She's married with 1 son and happens to have cerebral palsy. And in 2013, she was quoted in an article by the New York Times who they were starting to investigate what it's like for people with disabilities who have to visit the doctor. And she said that Ms. Jacobsen said that doctors will frequently look at her and make an incorrect assumption based upon her intelligence, just by the fact that she rolls in with a wheelchair, right? They feel that she doesn't quite understand her treatment options. Sometimes they demand that someone has to be there with her while she's there at the doctor because they don't think that she's going to understand what they're trying to say to her. And you hear this story a lot too. And these are the kinds of interactions that technology could help and could benefit and maybe should. And some might say that it's really about human rights. I'm showing a photo of Lisa Iazoni, an MD and director of the Mongan Institute for Health Policy. And she was quoted in that same New York Times article as saying that healthcare is really one of the last bastions of this kind of discrimination. She says it's curious because what we're talking about here is a fundamental need. It's fundamental healthcare. It's something that people desperately need, and it's been compromised. So we'll park that just for a moment because it's getting all gloom and doom, and I want to bring in even more inherent optimism. In this case, I've been doing a lot of work in the last few years of what I call food security. It's the ability of people who live in low access, low income areas to buy or purchase or acquire healthy, affordable food. And sometimes, we see these billboards dotted, at least in the U.S. I've seen them in Europe a few places, but mostly in the United States, where they have barcodes next to these products. The billboard looks just like a kind of a supermarket shelf. And the idea being that you go up with your phone and you scan the barcode that's there, you place your order, and within a couple of hours, a truck comes by with all your groceries just there waiting for you. And you would think that, oh gosh, for someone with a disability who can't leave the house, this is fantastic. This would be wonderful. And there's many initiatives taking place in areas in the industrialized world to improve food justice, improve everyone's right to afford and easily access culturally appropriate and nutritious food for their families. And what sometimes happens, at least in the U.S., is a site is identified, usually a low-income, low-access area. They have some sort of an awkward groundbreaking ceremony where people with suits come out and with shovels and hard hats, and they break ground, and they build a supermarket. And it's wonderful. The supermarket's there, and it's stocked with 46,000 products, and it does fine. And then 2 years later, the store can't make it profit margins, and it goes out of business. And now things are worse than ever because those people who were relying on that source no longer have it. And for some people, they were relying on it for their jobs and for employment. And things are worse than ever. And you may think, again, what does this have to do with accessibility? Well, you might be surprised. Disability compounds reduced earnings. It compounds fixed incomes. It means higher healthcare costs. And it also corresponds to a somewhat narrow view on how economics and capability really intersect. I'm showing a map of the United States, and I apologize for my non-U.S. folks. Hopefully this will be somewhat relevant. I don't want this to be too U.S.-centric because there are examples of this across the world. In the U.S., I'm showing a map of U.S. food assistance spending in 2013. This would be areas of the country that are highly reliant on government subsidies in order to buy food. It is heavily concentrated in Maine and the southeast United States, near the Texas-Mexico border, parts of Washington and Oregon State, and the northern portion of Michigan. And if we were to compare that to a map of census data representing people with disabilities in those same areas, it's very close. Once again, it's very concentrated in Maine, in the southeast United States, near Texas and Mexico, Washington, Oregon, and in Michigan. Right? It's not an exact 1-to-1 ratio, but it's close enough. It's close enough for comparison. Unless we think that this is highly anecdotal, there is a study by the USDA Economic Research Service that demonstrates the degree to which disability really does contribute to food insecurity. For adults, households that have no adults with disabilities, you're around 11 or 12% likely to be food insecure. That more than doubles if you have one adult with disability, and it triples if you have one adult who cannot work due to that disability. So it's not quite as anecdotal, right? And we really are talking about, in some ways, the way poverty intersects with disability sometimes. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Report of 2013 says that disability is not inability. In fact, disability is in many cases less of a handicap than the economic situation that accompanies it. They've noted for years the link between disability, poor nutrition, poor health, and poverty. According to a Gilmore research study, nearly 33% of low-income seniors and persons with disabilities who reside in government-subsidized public housing will regularly miss meals due to a lack of food because they simply can't get to a grocery store. And the same research has shown that diet-related diseases such as diabetes and heart disease will disproportionately affect low-income individuals with disabilities. This is Natacha Simpson, and she's at the University of California in Berkeley. She's done a lot of work in this space. And I like this quote that I read by her recently, where she says that disability justice is really everybody's movement, and that, by extension, makes it a human rights movement. So this is all getting very, very negative, and I feel like I'm being very pessimistic. So I want to give you an example of someone who's doing it right. This is Jeff Brown. And he leads an organization called Uplift Solutions in the U.S. And they've opened up thriving stores in Philadelphia and New York metropolitan areas. And he opens them in low-access, low-economic areas. And they do wonderful, and the stores are beautiful. And they're very, very successful. So you look at this and you think, what has he figured out? What has his organization figured out that maybe the rest of us haven't? You know, what's he doing right? What's he tapped into? Well, one thing he does is he actually reaches out to the people who live there to see, you know, what do you want to see in your store? And I thought, yeah, but there must be something more than that. So I wanted to understand this a few years ago. I wanted to get this. So I reached out to a man named Andy Nathan, who runs an advertising agency called Victor and Spoils. And I was intrigued by Mr. Nathan because I had read in a New York Times magazine that he did a campaign to get people across the United States to eat more broccoli. I thought that was kind of intriguing because what you're really trying to do is you're trying to change and modify behavior into healthy habits. And I was talking, and he was very, very free. He's a really nice guy, very, very smart. And he said, you know, Cal, the one thing you have to understand in any campaign like this, there's one thing you must fundamentally do before anything else. You have to create an enemy. Now, I ask all of you, what do you think is the enemy of broccoli? If you think it's steak, if you think it's cheese or chocolate or beer, You're wrong. The agency decided that the enemy of broccoli was kale. Kale was positioned as broccoli's hipster, hipster doofus cousin. Broccoli or kale was for people who didn't really want to be healthy, but broccoli was the real thing. So this is kind of amusing, but I started thinking, okay, who or what is the enemy of overly optimistic design thinking that doesn't take into account the behaviors that people actually have to use the service? Because maybe if we can identify that, maybe we can increase the accessibility of these fundamental services. And I think I found the answer. I think I found the answer in this photo, which I'm showing you, and I will describe it. It is a photo that was taken by my friend Deborah Gilman. I believe it's in Minsk. It is about 26 steps, right? I think I counted them. And it's a lot of steps. It's a long way to walk for someone who is elderly or frail. It's certainly much, much too long for someone in a wheelchair, if not impossible. So someone with the best of intentions decided, you know what, we should fix this. We can't have 26 steps here because some people can't use the steps. So they built, right there next to it, a long ramp, a long, steep ramp, and that travels down those 26-some steps at about a 45-degree incline. I would not want to be in a wheelchair flying down that ramp and hitting the bottom with a thud. But I'm thinking, this is the enemy, right? And again, it's not that there's malicious intent. It's just that maybe it's one of these things where we think of accessibility as the afterthought. It was the oh yeah, accessibility. Oh right, we should have thought of that. The final bullet point. The oh, you know we should really do that we didn't really think about up till now. So what I want to do here is maybe provide some examples of how we could flip the bit. Maybe it's not so much accessibility as the afterthought, but accessibility as the opportunity to innovate, the opportunity to start molding it into the way we build design thinking, the things that we already do and things that we can do, things we do really well, but just threading it into our existing thought processes. I'll give you a couple of ways I think we can do that, and then we'll take questions. I think we'll have time for that. So the first thing is understanding that there is a social model of exclusion that exists. And it really does begin during childhood, where we take kids who have disabilities and we put them on special buses and we take them to special buildings, and they have special teachers and they have special friends, and we call it special education. And we almost make sequestering a social norm. And I'm not saying it's necessarily our job as designers and developers and thinkers and makers to change that overnight, because I don't know if we can. I think it is, however, our responsibility to understand why and how that happens. Because once we do, getting to number 2 here, we recognize that competence is not a toggle. It really is a continuum. I often cite Thomas Armstrong's theory of neurodiversity, where he says we have to recognize that people with disabilities are very valuable. They're very important. They remind us that we're part of a human ecosystem. They remind us that we are all good at some things and not others. And that all has to do with human capability. It has to do with it's kind of a reframing of the original problem. And by doing that, getting to number 3, we focus less on those constraints. We focus more on the empowerment and how we can, in some ways, surface up those special abilities there, and how we can, maybe work within the window that we're given. I'm showing a photo of Ron Finley, who is known as the guerrilla gardener of Los Angeles. He takes urban lots in his neighborhood and turns them into small farms. And he didn't worry about things like zoning, for example, and he ran into a little bit of trouble in South Central Los Angeles in doing this. But now he does it, and it's thriving, and he concentrated more on the benefit in mind that he was trying to get to. He focused more on the empowerment of the people he was trying to serve. Fourth, this is very healthcare-centric, providing tools that encourage and activate support staff in the healthcare space. Healthcare is a kind of a unique industry in that it's designed for waiting. We have a room just for waiting. We call it the waiting room. And it always drives me crazy when, for example, someone who's blind, who is sitting in the waiting room and has no form of interaction except to wait to hear their name being called. They're surrounded by magazines they can't read, and they're looking at art that they can't look at. There's a clipboard they're supposed to fill out that they can't because it's just a pen on a piece of paper. That's a lost touch point. And I really do believe, and as someone who has had to have a lot of health things done to him over the past, let's say, 3 to 4 years. I really appreciate the front desk nurses as the real superheroes of the healthcare system. And there are things we can do from a technology perspective to activate that relationship and encourage that interaction and make it more productive and more meaningful. And maybe the way we do that is to start seeking inspiration from things around us, from curb cut examples, right? We always talk about take a look at a curb cut and how it's been developed and how it benefits everyone. That's a very old example. And what I always tell people I work with and students when I teach is, take a look at normal things around you and just think, how would I redesign this if it was someone who didn't have hands, or someone who couldn't use their hands, or someone who couldn't see, or someone who couldn't hear? How would I redesign this service? How would I change this up for someone who maybe couldn't walk as quickly as I can, someone who is in a wheelchair? Things like, how would I go into a Starbucks and order coffee, and how would I take it away? And it's a really fun, interesting exercise to go through. How would I redesign a game of Twister for someone who couldn't see? Things like that come up. Because once we start to do that, once we start to think like that, once we start to think like folks who are not necessarily like us, we begin to develop that oft-mentioned quality known as empathy. And empathy is not sympathy. It's not pity. It's about understanding. It's about accountability. It's about accountability to the people we're designing for. It's about accountability to their values and what compels them to do what they think they need to do, and working within that. This is one of my personal heroes, Dr. Michael Graves, who passed away last year, sadly. He was a former architect and artist who later started a company that made medical devices. And I want to read you a quote, and some of you have heard me read this before, but I like it still. At the age of 62, he went into the hospital with a sinus infection, and he wound up paraplegic. And this can happen because bacteria is strange, and we don't always understand everything that happens in the body. And he wrote something very interesting in his blog, and he talked about the first day that he knew his life had changed. And I'm going to read this to you. This is Dr. Michael Graves. He wrote, "Early on, my first day out of bed at Kessler Hospital, I went into the bathroom in my wheelchair to shave. I looked in the mirror, and the bottom was at the height of my forehead. I couldn't see my face, so there was no shaving with a straight razor. An electric razor was brought to me, and I tried to plug it in, and it was out of reach. I thought, at least I can wash my face, but I couldn't reach the faucet. So the next day, my surgeon came by. I asked him to get in a wheelchair. I strapped him in, and he couldn't reach anything. I asked, who designed this? And he said, experts." And my point here is that we do need experts, right? And it's easy to talk about big bad healthcare and big bad grocery retailers, but that's not really the case. We need experts because the experts tell us what's possible, and the experts extend what's possible. But we also need empathy in order to make sure that the experts' best intentions are applied as reasonably as it can be. I'm almost done speaking with you. I would like to leave you with 3 takeaways, and I'm going to frame these in the words of my late grandfather, who was also an architect, because I just think they're good rules of life. And he was also a little bit of a curmudgeon, and so I took out a lot of the F-bombs and things here. So I kind of want to keep this, reasonably clean, PG-13. But I always think these are good lessons for life. And I think these are good lessons for taking us out into the world and ensuring that we're doing what we can for those around us and removing the barriers to the things that they fundamentally need. The first quote is, "If it was a snake, it would bite you," which is what my grandfather used to say when I was helping him around his house. And he would send me to the garage to go look for something, and I couldn't find it. And he would, it'd be right in front of my face, and he'd come in like, "Geez, if there's a snake, it would bite you." And he'd just take it down. We're often surrounded by things that are hidden in plain sight. Chances are there's something very obvious that we've missed. The 5-gallon container is one example of that. You're like, of course, someone can't lift 5 gallons on their head and walk any distance, of course. But we don't think about it until it's revealed to us, right? Until it exposes itself as a potential problem, right? So sometimes, we just get bitten by things like this, and that's okay. The important thing is to recognize it when it does happen and, design through it. The second is you can't get up from the top. When he used to say, the world's full of nice, smart people who can't rake a damn leaf. That's what he used to say. Because you're going to fail. And I've done it many, many times. And I give this talk and I mention all these examples, and I have designed things that did not work out for whatever reason. And chances are it's because I didn't take into account the behaviors of the people who really need to use them. But that's part of the learning. And it's okay to go through that learning. It's okay to stumble. Every failure is an opportunity. And every bit of success is really a process. There's no point where it becomes accessible or not. It's not a toggle necessarily. It's, if you can be 10% more accessible than you were a week ago, that's good. That's a trend. That's a positive trend. And maybe you get to 15% next week, maybe 20% next week after that. So just remember, you can't get up from a perfect position. And finally, remember where you came from. Because what I'm talking about here is fundamental to human survival. It is food and health accessibility is about more than apps and machines. It's about more than what can go on a phone or what a website does. It really is about heritage, and it's about culture and love and faith and healing and pride. And when people don't have to worry so much about how to keep themselves and their families healthy, it binds families, it builds communities, it reduces social isolation, and it makes for a more inclusive society. And I've said before in many places and on many stages that technology is not neutral. Every form of innovation is about extending human capability that removes barriers, that helps people meet the things that they fundamentally need. And every technological innovation over the past 3 centuries has had this in mind in some form or another, whether it was the first prosthetic hand in Paris in the 1800s, or the advent of movable type, or today now where they're using smartphone apps to regulate the price of crops in Kenya, or something new that's yet to emerge, something where the technology is going to be infused within our homes, as was announced this week, or even within our bodies. The science fiction world that we keep thinking about is starting to happen. Everyone who is listening to this right now is a part of it. You're living in it, and you're creating it. I will leave you with this quote by the science fiction author William Gibson when he says that the future has already arrived, it is just not evenly distributed yet. But I think the folks who are behind this event, this ID24 event, are doing something about that, and I think all of you are doing something about that. Thank you for your time. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with all of you today. My name is Kel Smith. My email is kel.smith@anikto, anikto.com. Happy to take your thoughts or queries or questions. In case you're interested, I did write a book. It is called Digital Outcast: Moving Technology Forward Without Leaving People Behind. It was published 3 years ago by Morgan Kaufman. I think it still holds up. People tell me it does. So, I mean, they can't all be lying to me. I try to future-proof it. And I am writing a new book now called Pixel Pushers, The Eccentrics, Egotists, Bullies, and Cowards of the Internet. It mostly has to do with cyberbullying and things related to that. And it's a horrific subject matter, which is probably why I haven't finished it yet, because it skeeves me out. But I think we have a few minutes here, so I don't know if you want to ask me questions, or Mike, if you want to filter them, or how this works. So, but I'm happy to take any dialogue.
Hey, Kel, thanks very much, man. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation, but I knew it would be anything worse than that, better than that, from that standpoint. John is fielding questions. Let's see, I've got a little background echo going on here.
There really hasn't been very many questions, but I'd just like to say that this is a great presentation. It was very fascinating, and as a designer, I'd like to say thank you for making a very beautiful presentation.
Oh, cheers. Well, thank you.
Just from an artist's point of view.
Well, cheers. Thank you. These are, and if folks have questions, if they want to have dialogue, I'm no pun intended, I'm accessible via usual channels, and if you pop me an email or catch me on Twitter or something, I'll be happy to engage with folks. But this is, Mike, you've known me for many years, so this is one of those areas where I have a lot of passion, and I know other people do as well. So it's, and I kind of, in a way, I should have really credited Carl Gross, because he once said something where, it's really about connecting people to fundamental human needs. And I've always kind of remembered him saying that to me once, and then I kind of like a little seed that kind of went in my head, and I thought, that really is what it is. I mean, everything else we're talking about here gets down to a detail level, and those details are critically important. Again, why we need experts. But it's also keeping in mind, kind of the greater mission of what this is about. So, and I know everyone behind ID24 feels the same way. I know that for a fact. So, but thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, no worries. Hey, Kel, and I just wanted to say, a couple of things. It was kind of funny as you were going through those last couple of slides, and I'm writing my own notes. I can't help but think how far we've come since I started, back in the early to mid '80s, working in my HCI group at Digital Equipment, and we have slowly made this transition that still needs a lot more force and a lot more empowerment behind it, but towards empathic design. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I used to hear some of the well-known folks in the usability and UX field talk about human-centered design, right, and human-computer interaction, and what that really meant. And in every situation, leaving individuals who had different abilities, whether, as Makoto was talking about before, related to language, or whether it relates to health in one form or another, or sensory, empathic design. This notion of thinking accessibility and building that into the DNA of the designers and developers of the world that are out there, and I know many that are listening, in on these sessions. I think that's really a very strong message, and I appreciate you emphasizing that in today's talk.
Yeah, no, thank you, and you're right. It is better. I mean, it always could be better, but it's certainly better than it was 10 years ago. And it's funny. When I was first developing this presentation for, I think it was a TED MedX talk in Stanford University like a year or two ago, and my friend Dean Caraviti at the Center for Biomedical Informatics at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, I asked him to take a look at it, and he said, you want to be a little careful here, because you don't want to just have empathy just for patients. You also want to have empathy for people who work within the system, and you want to have empathy also for the forces that they have to sort of compete with in order to do the right thing. So I think that's why I always make the comment of, like, it's not just the big bad system that's making it horrible. I mean, it's
Right.
there are people who are trying to do the right thing, and it's also about having empathy for the what has compelled the situation to be what it is today. Good, bad, or indifferent. And I always remember Dean kind of telling me this, and I think that's and also with Franklin Macchia and Gavin Kerr at the English Foundation, Jim Tobias gave me really good input. These are, it's good to take all these inputs and realize that it's not just like burning down the the landscape. Like it's all broken. We're just going to fix it all. We're going to disrupt everything. No, that's not always the best path, because there are systemic forces that are populated by folks who really are doing the right thing, and they are well-designed systems, at least as well-designed as they can be today, and they're probably better than they were 10, 15 years ago, and I have every optimistic belief that they'll be better 10 to 15 years from now.
Yeah, I agree. Hey, I do have one question, though, just in carrying this thought forward. What do you think our role and responsibility is to not just carrying the message, but teaching it and building this think accessibility mindset into the technology world. Never mind everything else that you talked about today. I mean, what's our responsibility? The roles of us who particularly are professionals or individuals themselves with disabilities who are key and integral to empowering the kind of change that we're talking about through empathic design. What's our responsibility?
Wow. Well, that's a very weighted question. Yeah.
It was the idea.
Yeah, I know. I think part of the responsibility is taking part in events like this, and just being. I think there's a couple layers of responsibility that come in there. One is recognizing that I don't know everything. right? And I go into every endeavor with just right away thinking, I don't know. You need to tell me what's important, you know, because I don't know what it's like to be blind. I've never been blind. I've had pink eye. I was kind of blind a couple of times, but I've never been, you know, and I had to discover this when trying to design in low-income, low-access areas in the food space. I had to understand what that's like, and sometimes it's about immersing ourselves in that, you know, kind of in an environment, and then I think the second layer is just listening, you know, just kind of just catching the inputs and trying and actively listening between the lines, trying to hear what you think is being said, and then trying to replay it back to the people you're talking to and say, okay, if I understand correctly, you really want to you want bang 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 bang, and what I think you're really asking for is this, and then putting that to them, and I think one of the other things I think happens. Again, it's one of those well-meaning, well-intentioned things is we go into solution space very quickly sometimes, especially in technology. We're going to I build a blank, and it's just going to solve all the problems. Well, like I said, I've made that mistake many times. Like, I've got an idea, and it's going to be brilliant, and it goes, and it's crap. And it's crap because I didn't do the things I just mentioned, and I didn't realize, like, oh, you know, I had no idea someone's going to use it like this. And again, it's that idea of, I might be wrong, but that's okay. I'll just learn from that, and maybe it's not just going in with the idea like, hey, I know there's a problem. It's a very big problem. It's a very complex problem, and I made an app, and it's going to solve it. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's a ridiculous premise in many ways, because what I'm describing here are very complex social issues, and I don't know that any one app or system or technology can solve them overnight. But I think that a complementary array of good, well-designed technology solutions potentially could, in their own ways, for the select targets that they're intended for. You know, that's probably the best I can give you.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on it. John, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but you know, I've always kind of constantly within our organization here at TPG, one of the things that I keep trying to I hate to use the word preach, but it's kind of comes off that way a lot of times. I keep telling everyone we got to communicate. Part of that communication, a very key part of that communication process, though, is it's the old Stephen Covey line, right? Seek first to understand, and that is why UX has become a real foundational stone now, and key cornerstone now to our work and what we're doing. So we've got David Sloan and Sarah Hort and Henny Swan, and now we've got Adrian Roselli and others that have been working with us. And this is something that we're really trying to teach, and I am using that word with a purpose, because that's what we're going to have to do. Our responsibility, I believe, is we need to set the example and then teach it to everyone and anyone that we come in contact with.
Yeah, it's like any muscle. It can be exercised and it can get stronger. You know, and I often think of empathy as an exercise, because if it's about understanding, we always have the opportunity to understand better just by getting more input and getting more knowledge and finding out things we didn't find out before. And in some ways, maybe discarding things that no longer work, and that's an important part of it too. It's realizing, like, you know what, this was a great idea 7 years ago, is a better idea maybe 3 years ago, and maybe it just doesn't do it anymore. Maybe we've just, maybe the behavioral, technology, or political or social factors have just rendered it now to the point where it needs an update, or maybe it just discarded. You know, but those are all things that can be learned. So
awesome. Okay, John, anything on your end?
No, this has been a great conversation, and we can always feel free to continue the conversation on Twitter using the ID24 hashtag. Should be great. It'd be wonderful just to keep talking about this. This is really, really cool. But I think sadly we're going to have to close the this particular session for this one time. So it was really nice to host you this hour.
Cheers. Such a party pooper, John.
I know. I'm always a downer.
Everyone have a great rest of your day. Enjoy.
All right.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kel. Thank you, buddy.
Take care.
Bye-bye. So folks that are still online watching ID 24, we're coming down the backstretch here, the last few hours. Our next presentation again is I think you're really going to enjoy it. It's another good friend of ours, Lainey Feingold, and at the top of the hour, 12 noon here on the East Coast, 1600 UTC, Lainey is going to speak to us on the topic, what's law got to do with it? The role of law in developing an accessible, usable digital world. So if you haven't heard Lainey speak before, please take the time to listen in, because she's just an awesome speaker, and we look forward to her session. So John, buddy, I'm going to close out this session, and we'll come back in about 15 minutes.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks a lot.